Vaše magnificence, magnificí, spectabiles, honorabiles, vážení hosté, dámy a pánové. Zahajuji slavnostní zasedání Vědecké rady Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, na němž bude udělena čestná vědecká hodnost doktora ekonomických věd profesoru Robertu Kaplanovi. Úvodem si dovoluji vás upozornit, že tato akce je nahrávána, abychom umožnili všem, kteří se nemohli na slavnost dostavit, shlédnout ji dodatečně. V souladu se svým posláním a vědeckým zaměřením uděluje Vysoká škola ekonomická v Praze akademický titul Čestný doktor ekonomie zvláště významným představitelům české a světové vědy a praxe, zejména v oblasti ekonomických věd. Těmto hlediskům plně odpovídá celoživotní práce pana profesora Kaplana a proto mu naše vysoká škola chce tímto způsobem vzdát poctu. Dovolte, abych jménem rektorky Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, profesorky inženýrky Hany Machkové, kandidátky věd, mezi námi co nejúpřímněji uvítal kandidáta titulu Čestný doktor ekonomie, pana profesora Roberta Kaplana, profesora Harvard Business School. Jsem potěšen, že mohu na dnešním slavnostním shromáždění přivítat kromě profesora Kaplana i jeho manželku. Vítám členy Vědecké rady Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, prorektory školy, děkany jednotlivých fakult, členy jejich kolegií a vědeckých rad, předsedu a členy akademického senátu naší vysoké školy i jejich jednotlivých fakult. Dále mezi námi vítám rektory, prorektory, děkany a další představitele veřejných i soukromých vysokých škol. Vítám rovněž přítomné velvyslance, zejména zástupce velvyslanectví Spojených států amerických v Praze a představitele významných podniků a dalších institucí. V neposlední řadě vítám profesory, docenty, asistenty, studenty a pracovníky Vysoké školy ekonomické a další milé hosty, kteří přijali pozvání na toto slavnostní zasedání. Dámy a pánové, tímto považuji promoční akt za zahájený a podle protokolu uděluji slovo spectabilis děkanovi Fakulty financí a účetnictví, docentu inženýru Ladislavu Mejzlíkovi, PhD. Žádám vás, spectabilis, vážený pane děkane, abyste představil kandidáta titulu Čestný doktor ekonomie, pana profesora Kaplana.
Já především děkuji majestáty prorektorovi pro vědu a výzkum Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, panu profesoru Petru Musílkovi, za udělení slova. Vážená magnificence, paní rektorko, páni rektoři, majestáty, paní prorektorko a pane prorektore, spectabilis, vážení děkani, honorabiles, milí kolegové a kolegyně a vážený pane profesore Kaplane. Je mi ctí přivítat nejen vás, ale i jejich excelence, velvyslance a všechny zástupce institucí a firem, stejně jako i všechny ostatní vážené hosty a mé kolegy a kolegyně na tomto slavnostním ceremoniálu udělení čestného doktorátu a pokusím se zhostit nelehkého úkolu představit pro vás práci pana profesora Kaplana a zároveň vyjádřit svůj pohled na to, jak jeho práce ovlivnila naši společnost. Profesor Kaplan se narodil 2. května 1940. Svůj bakalářský i magisterský titul získal na MIT v oboru elektrotechnika. Poté pokračoval na Cornell University, kde získal titul PhD, a to již v oboru operační výzkum. Svou akademickou kariéru zahájil v roce 1968 na Tepper School of Business na Carnegie Mellon University, se kterou jsou spojeny mimo jiné jména 9 nositelů Nobelových cen za ekonomii. A není možné v této souvislosti tedy opomenout, že v letech 1977 až 1983 byl děkanem této fakulty. V roce 1984 přešel na Harvard Business School na pozici profesora v oboru rozvoje metod vedení společností a s Harvardem je spojen až dodnes. Jako odborník na oblast strategického řízení, řízení nákladů a výkonnosti, a to na katedře účetnictví a managementu. Kdybych měl vybrat největší počiny profesora Kaplana v oblasti výzkumu a jeho aplikace v praxi, tak to budou následující 2. Jako první bych jmenoval nepochybně metodu Balance Scorecard, kterou profesor Kaplan vytvořil spolu s Davidem Nortonem jako způsob, jak propojit běžnou činnost společností s jejími dlouhodobými cíli a jak měřit výkonnost firem tak, aby se neomezovala jen na výkonnost finanční, což do té doby bylo zvykem. Metoda Balance Scorecard byla představena poprvé v článku v roce 1992, který byl publikován v Harvard Business Review, a tato metoda se postupně rozšířila do společností ze všech průmyslových odvětví do všech koutů světa. Balance Scorecard se standardně používá pro procesy řízení nejen ve velkých holdingových společností, ale dnes i malých a středních podniků a také vládních a neziskových organizací. Kdybychom chtěli jen namátkou jmenovat, tak na tom dlouhém seznamu je JP Morgan, Allianz, Citibank, Mobil Oil, Volkswagen, Ford Motor Company, Veolia Water, Philips Electronics, UPS, Apple, Microsoft, Verizon, AT&T, ale dnes také v oblasti veřejného a neziskového sektoru, jako například FBI nebo z University of Virginia. Jako druhou oblast bych jmenoval metodu Time-Driven Activity-Based Costing, kterou vytvořil profesor Kaplan se Stevenem Andersonem a ve které se jedná o vylepšení klasické metodiky alokace nepřímých nákladů, kterou známe pod zkratkou ABC, již zhruba od 70. let minulého století. Tato metoda však byla velmi zdlouhavá a náročná na čas a na specializaci odborníků, kteří ji vytvářeli. Vylepšení profesora Kaplana je flexibilnější. Pomáhá společnostm dostat se na přímočařejší a výkonnější cestu k vyšším ziskům. V poslední době se tato metodika používá například ve zdravotnictví k měření nákladu napříč celým procesem zdravotní péče o daného pacienta. V obou zmíněných oblastech je profesor Kaplan autorem nebo spoluautorem mnoha knih a také článků v těch nejkvalitnějších světových časopisech. Všechny tyto jeho publikační počiny mají dnes více než 10 000 citací v citačních databázích Web of Science a Scopus. Kniha The Execution Premium Linking Strategy to Operations for Competitive Advantage, Alignment, Strategy Maps byla společností Amazon vybrána jako jedna z nejlepších knih pro praxi za rok 2004. The Strategy Focused Organization ocenila Capgemini od Ernst & Young jako nejlepší mezinárodní knihu pro podnikatele a konečně kniha The Blend Scorecard, která byla přeložena do všech 24 jazyků důležitých, a to včetně češtiny, za svůj výjimečný dopad na praxi získala Wildmanovu medaili v roce 2001 od American Accounting Association. Pan profesor Kaplan byl spoluzakladatelem skupiny ESM Software Group, která se spolu s několika dalšími společnostmi stala součástí mezinárodní poradenské a manažerské společnosti Palladium International, ve které se sám osobně zcela nezastupitelně podílel na jejím ideovém vedení. Palladium International spolupracuje nyní s vládami, podniky, investory na řešení těch nejnaléhavějších výzev na světě a působí v současnosti ve více než 90 zemích po celém světě a zaměstnává přibližně 2 500 odborníků. Od roku 2000 tato organizace uděluje ocenění Balance Scorecard Hall of Fame, a to těm organizacím, které metodu Balance Scorecard s úspěchem implementovaly do svých systémů řízení a prokázali tím její účinnost. Za svou práci byl pan profesor Kaplan uveden do síně slávy účetní a získal ocenění za svůj celoživotní přínos právě od American Accounting Association a je nositelem čestných doktorátů z několika evropských i amerických univerzit. Pokud se budeme snažit porozumět, jak důležitou změnu Balance Scorecard při svém vzniku přinesla, musíme se vrátit do roku 1992, kdy Michael Porter v zářijovém čísle Harvard Business Review identifikoval tehdejší problémy investování amerických společností a konstatoval 3 základní problémy. Za prvé, že americký systém málo podporuje dlouhodobé investice, protože je zaměřen zejména na zvýšení krátkodobých výstupů, které rychle a přímo ovlivňují cenu akcií. Za druhé identifikoval, že systém podporuje takové formy investic, jejichž návratnost je dobře měřitelná, což následně vede k nedostatečnému investování například do nehmotných aktiv, do inovací produktů a procesů, do zvyšování kvalifikovanosti zaměstnanců a také zvyšování spokojenosti zákazníků, protože jejich krátkodobé návratnosti jsou velmi obtížně měřitelné. A za třetí, systém vedl k preferenci investic do aktiv, která lze snadno ocenit. Jejich ocenění je jednoduché technicky a k nedostatečnému investování do projektů interního rozvoje, jejichž výstupy lze naopak ocenit jen velmi obtížně. Když se podíváme na společného jmenovatele všech těchto 3 identifikovaných nedostatků, tak zjistíme, že přílišný důraz byl kladen na finanční měřítka výkonnosti a malé propojení bylo s dlouhodobými strategickými cíli. A to je právě to, co metoda Balance Scorecard pomohla odstranit. I když metoda Balance Scorecard vznikla téměř před 30 lety, jsem přesvědčen, že je stále aktuální. Realizace strategických cílů je stále více problémem číslo 1 a to všech dnešních vedoucích pracovníků a jsou podle ní také hodnoceni a odměňováni. Balance Scorecard je transparentní metodou, která poskytuje kvantifikovatelné metriky, umožňuje tak pružně reagovat v konkurenčním prostředí a v neposlední řadě se jedná o metodu, která je snadno přizpůsobitelná pro konkrétní oblast, obor činnosti a na konkrétní podmínky společnosti. Nelze také opomenout skutečnost, jaký význam v posledních desetiletích nabývá celá oblast nefinančního výkaznictví. Jedná se o oblast sociální odpovědnosti, ekologie, genderové a rasové rovnosti, lidských práv, ochrany spotřebitelů a podobně. Všechny tyto oblasti se stále více integrují a propojují do jednoho celku. Tyto oblasti se stávají součástí mise a vize všech společností a míra jejich plnění se stává součástí regulovaného výkaznictví. Pro celou tuto oblast se dnes stále častěji používá označení ESG, Environmental, Social and Corporate Governance. A ročně jsou do této oblasti investovány globálně obrovské částky s velkými tempy růstu. A i zde je prostor pro implementaci metod, na kterých profesor Kaplan dlouhodobě pracuje. Proto není náhodou, že jeho dnešní přednáška bude na téma aplikace metod Activity-Based Costing and Balance Scorecard v sociální a environmentální sféře, ve které představí využití svých metod ve zdravotnictví, v oblasti inkluzivních růstových ekosystémů a v oblasti environmentálních a sociálních aspektů správy podniků, včetně ESG. Dovolte mi osobní poznámku. Profesor Kaplan pro mě není jen velikánem strategického řízení a manažerského účetnictví, ale je inspirující osobností zejména tím, jak výsledky jeho akademické práce ovlivnily globální měřítku reálnou ekonomickou praxi podniků. Aplikace metod Balance Scorecard a Time-Driven Activity-Based Costing přinesly ve své době zcela zásadní změnu ve způsobu dosavadního myšlení v oblasti strategického řízení. Tyto metody se různými způsoby a v různých modifikacích staly neoddělitelnou součástí postupů při vytváření strategických plánů. Jejich názvy nesou nejrůznější instituce, společnosti, softwarové produkty a na konzultační úrovni patří tyto metody k základní výbavě každé renomované poradenské firmy. Zcela nepochybné je, že tyto metody jsou také součástí výuky manažerského účetnictví na všech univerzitách, Vysokou školu ekonomickou nevyjímaje. Obě metody jsou velmi populární a používané i po mnoha letech od jejich vzniku a pan profesor Kaplan je nadále rozvíjí. Na závěr mi dovolte ještě jednu poznámku. Chtěl bych vyzdvihnout přátelskost a flexibilitu, s jakou pan profesor Kaplan reagoval nejen na nabídku VŠE udělení titulu čestného doktorátu, ale i následnou organizaci jeho slavnostního předání na půdě VŠE, které mělo původně proběhnout již v dubnu 2020. Ale muselo být kvůli opatřením v důsledku covidu zrušeno a bylo možno jej uskutečnit až nyní. Za tuto vstřícnost bych chtěl jak panu profesoru Kaplanovi, tak i zde přítomné manželce paní Ellen Kaplan velmi poděkovat. Děkuji vám za pozornost.
Děkuji vám, spektabilis, vážený pane děkane, za představení kandidáta titulu Čestný doktor ekonomie, pana profesora Kaplana. Nyní prosím její magnificenci, rektorku Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, profesorku Hanu Machkovou, aby laskavě vyslovila svůj rektorský souhlas s udělením čestné vědecké hodnosti doktora ekonomických věd panu profesoru Kaplanovi.
Vzhledem k tomu, že jsou splněny všechny zákonné podmínky, ráda vyhovuji honesté, pane promotore, vaší žádosti a dávám svůj rektorský souhlas s udělením čestné vědecké hodnosti doktora ekonomických věd panu profesoru Robertu Kaplanovi. Žádám vás, abyste se podle obyčejů naší školy ujal úřadu promotora.
Vážený pane profesore Kaplane, vědecká rada oceňuje váš přínos pro rozvoj ekonomie v oblasti strategického řízení, řízení rizik a manažerského účetnictví. Výsledky vaší dlouhodobé vědecko-výzkumné činnosti jsou součástí trvalých hodnot, o které se opírá i naše vysoká škola. Vědecká rada Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze se proto usnesla udělit vám čestnou vědeckou hodnost doktora ekonomických věd. Žádám vás nyní, abyste přijal tuto nejvyšší poctu, kterou vás naše vysoká škola může vyznamenat, a abyste složil do rukou její magnificence, rektorky Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, tento slavnostní slib. Prosím, povstaňte. Rektorce Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze a její akademické obci slibuji, že jako doktor honoris causa budu svou činností podporovat rozvoj vědeckého poznání ve prospěch dobra, i nadále se budu řídit zásadami etiky a přispívat k rozvoji svobody a práva. Svým jednáním budu vždy zachovávat vážnost a dobré jméno Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze a podle svých možností budu podporovat její vzdělávací a vědeckou činnost. Prosím, pane profesore Kaplane, abyste tento slib složil. Profesor Kaplan, now I ask you to take the oath.
I do so swear.
Vážení hosté, posaďte se, prosím. Vážený pane profesore Kaplane, vaším slibem byla splněna poslední podmínka nutná k tomu, aby vám byla udělena pocta, již si vás přeje vyznamenat naše vědecká rada. Já, řádně stanovený promotor, propůjčuji vám z usnesení vědecké rady za vaše již dříve zmíněné zásluhy titul doktor ekonomie honoris causa Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze a uděluji vám všechna práva a výsady, které z titulu doktora honoris causa vyplývají. Vaše magnificence, vážená paní rektorko, žádám vás, abyste profesoru Robertu Kaplanovi, doktoru honoris causa Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, předala jmenovací diplom a doktorskou medaili. Vážené slavnostní shromáždění, dovolte, abych jménem její magnificence, profesorky Hany Machkové, jménem vědecké rady i jménem svým vyslovil doktoru ekonomie honoris causa naší vysoké školy profesoru Robertu Kaplanovi upřímné blahopřání. Nyní uděluji slovo panu profesoru Kaplanovi. Profesor Kaplan, Doctor Economie honoris causa of the Prague University of Economics and Business. Now I ask you to take the floor.
Rector Makova, Dean Maislik, all the assembled rectors of the great universities of the Czech Republic, faculty and students, I am deeply touched. Thank you very much for this great honor and the privilege to come and be at this great university and have the opportunity of at this point sharing, some remarks about how a professor of accounting can not only make a contribution in the Faculty of Economics, but as stated by the scientific panel, to actually make a contribution to society. I would say for the first 40 years of my professional scholarly work, which is extremely well summarized and described by Dean Majlik, my focus primarily, was how to make companies perform better, how to use measurement as the foundation for improving their performance. And as you heard, that I was trained as an engineer, electrical engineer, and then in operations research. And measurement is foundational for science and for engineering. We like to quote the saying of the great 19th century British physicist, Lord Kelvin. He says, when you can measure what you are speaking about and trying to understand, then you know something about it. But without numbers and without measurement, your knowledge of phenomena can be of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. So much of my career has been to try to increase knowledge of business and management practice. Great management contributor, scholar Peter Drucker said it very simply: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and if you can't manage it, you can't improve it. And I think over my now 50 plus years of academic work, I've been fortunate to keep finding situations where the measurement has not been so good. And that provided an opportunity for me in understanding the phenomena and working within it to improve the measurement and therefore the management of important phenomena. But for the first 40 years, I would say up through 2010, the work had been primarily the private sector. Though, as Dean Majlik noted, we were able to extend some of those results into both the public sector and the nonprofit sector. But in the past decade, as I reached a stage when most faculty my age start to improve their golf game rather than their publication record, I found actually phenomenon in society that was so fascinating, but that was so undermeasured that I could not stop working on these areas. And so I'm going to briefly describe the three areas that have occupied my attention for the past decade or so. I have supplied the Dean with the specific references for faculty and students that want to read more about it, certainly delve into the articles, because by nature I will have to go very quickly into what will end up being a fairly dense set of ideas about the roles for measurement to improve in healthcare, in the environment, and to deal with poverty and inequality. These are topics that accounting people don't normally get to work on. So this is what has been great fun and very rewarding over this period. So I came to healthcare stimulated by my strategy colleague, Professor Michael Porter, who was similarly troubled with how ineffective and inefficient healthcare was, primarily in the United States, but really throughout the rest of the world, as we've seen. And Michael, with his elegant and simple framework, says one of the problems is healthcare hasn't agreed on what it wants to accomplish. They have various different goals, but none of which provided a unified framework for making healthcare both more effective and also more efficient. And so Michael, in 2006, came up with the value framework, which you see briefly here, that the goal has to be to improve outcomes, health outcomes that matter to patients, not to physicians or surgeons, but to the patients, and do that while lowering the cost to society of achieving those outcomes. There's two other parts of this. We're going to measure this value, outcomes and cost, at the medical condition level, not at the hospital level or physician practice level, and measure it not incident by incident, but over a complete cycle of care for treating the patient. So how did I get involved in this? Somewhere in February 2010, Michael calls me. We'd been colleagues for 30 years. We were friends. It was really the first time he had ever called me. Strategy professors typically don't call accounting professors. And he said, Bob, and he said, what? He says, I'm working on healthcare. And I said, well, no, I've been following it. It's terrific. And he says, the problem is cost is an important element in my framework. And I said, yes. He says, no one seems to be measuring cost in any way that makes sense to me. I said, Michael, you are a brilliant economist, and the way healthcare people measure cost should not make sense to you. They get confused between how much they charge people versus what it costs them. So he says, well, where can I go to find out about this? And I said, well, you've probably come to the right place. I actually think I know how to do this because I've done this in every other sector with time-driven, activity-based costing, but healthcare has been resistant. And I said, we don't have to write papers on this. I know the technique and it's going to work. We have to work with actual hospitals. And he said, well, I know some, and you want to do this together? And I said, that would be fantastic. So that turned out to be an incredible collaboration that continues to the present day. And so what was the problem is one of the barriers for implementing value-based healthcare is bad measurement. They didn't measure cost correctly. They didn't understand what it cost them. And so the solution that I worked on was to introduce this method that had been developed for the private sector and take it into healthcare. And briefly, this is actually conceptually very simple. You do a bottoms-up approach. You watch how the physicians are treating patients over this cycle of care. And you just document how these are actually done. What is the sequence of steps required to care for a patient? At each step, who's doing it? And how long are they spending on it? And I'll illustrate this in a moment. Secondly, what does each one of these people cost? So doctors cost a lot, nurses cost less than doctors, but more than clinical assistants or paramedical personnel. So we have to find out what each one of the people cost and the equipment cost, and then add in what the cost of purchased items like drugs and devices and supplies that are used. And so we developed the idea of a process map. You can see here, you're not supposed to read this. The different colors correspond to different kinds of people. An office assistant, a technician, a surgeon, an x-ray technician, a nurse. And you can see even in a simple office visit, which is here, 6 different types of people are involved in the care. And the little circles with a number in it is the approximate time in minutes they spend on this task. So this is the primary work that we have to do, is to document how patients are actually treated. Which seems simple, but this was new to medicine. Automobile companies were doing this 100 years ago, but healthcare was always an art, not a science, and so they had never documented the sequence of steps they were using to treat a patient. Second step was cost accounting for each of the types of people. How much does it cost a year to have them available for work? How many minutes a year do they have available for doing clinical work? So those are relatively easy to estimate, and we get to a cost per minute for surgeons. These are US prices if they seem high for the Czech Republic. You all know we pay too much for our healthcare people, but that's out of scope for me as a cost accounting professor. I can just document how much they actually cost. With these 2 pieces of information, how much time each of these types of personnel spend, what's their cost per minute, we just string together the process maps, and on the right-hand side of this, if you can see it, is multiplying number of minutes times cost per minute and add it up. So we can do this on an Excel spreadsheet. You don't need very complicated software. This is the first time that a physician or a healthcare executive knew what it really cost to treat a patient across a complete cycle of care through all the people and processes that were being used. And once we use this and you show this to the physicians, it makes sense to them. So, no, I guess this is the way we're treating them now. Well, there's some steps here that are not going to give us better outcomes. So let's stop doing them. You know, they're wasteful steps if they're not contributing to better outcome. Some of the studies I'm most excited about and I enjoy is we compare costs for treating the same condition over different facilities and it costs in different countries. So we've compared heart surgery in India, at Dr. Shetty's great heart surgery facility outside Bangalore with US hospitals. And we can control for the difference in prices that you pay for people. And it turns out even if the Indian hospital paid US prices to all its people, it was still cheaper than the US hospitals. They were more efficient and they used a better mix of personnel. And we just published an article in the New England Journal comparing cataract costs in Stanford Medical Center with Aravind Hospital, also a high-volume Indian hospital, and an amazing hospital in Nepal. And again, we can take out the differences in prices and currencies and just look at the pure efficiency and productivity of people doing the same procedure in widely different places. And once you see that, you can learn from the best practices and redesign them to reduce inefficiencies, waste, and achieve the same or better outcomes with a lower cost mix of resources. You can optimize the cycle of care. It turns out that if surgeons spent more time with the patients before surgery, saying you're going to have to give up alcohol and drugs, you have to get your diabetes under control, you have to lose some weight, the outcomes from the surgery are far better and lower cost because you have fewer complications. So it's better to spend a little bit of money before the surgery and you can save money afterwards. And they never saw those types of trade-offs until we gave them this tool. And it enabled the surgeons to do what surgeons are best qualified to do and have lower paid people do a lot of the other stuff. You know, because their cost per minute is only 10% of the physician or surgeon. The surgeon shouldn't be doing work that those lower paid people can do. So it has been hugely successful. We're still going on. We don't have any projects yet in Czech Republic. It's an open invitation. So if you know of a healthcare or hospital that wants to do this, get in touch with me, and you know we can train people up, and they can start benefiting from this as well. You know, we're starting a project in the University of Vienna on heart surgery. Okay, so this is the healthcare. Now, what about the society and environment? Before doing this, I guess this is my Milton Friedman moment. And I know Milton got up one of your first honorary degrees here. And Milton, of course, was a champion of capitalism. And you've had Bob Mundell here and others of that, and Gary Becker. And I follow in their tradition. So this is a chart of the red portion of this chart is the number of people in the world living in extreme poverty, defined as less than $2 a day in today's income. And you can see it 200 years ago, 98% of the 1 million people on Earth were living in less than $2 a day in dire poverty. And an amazing thing has happened in the last 200 years. As you see, actually, with 7 million people, we have fewer people living in dire poverty than existed 200 years ago. And you can see what happened in the right-hand portion of the curve, because the Czech Republic contributed to that. Somewhere around 1990, socialism ended, and capitalism came finally to Central and Eastern Europe and India and China. And you can see the impact. So what this tells me is, you know, we don't want to destroy this engine of income and productivity. This is very precious because we've had 50,000 years of human existence living in dire poverty, and we've kind of discovered the secret sauce that enables people to have higher income and higher wealth, and it comes from capitalism. But there are some what economists call negative externalities associated with that 200 years of growth. So we're very familiar with the enormous increase in greenhouse gases because some of that growth has been fueled by the energy revolution. And despite this great increase in wealth, we still have 900 million people living in dire poverty, and some people have been made worse off by trends in globalization and automation. And that's led to this increase in inequality that has really called capitalism into question, certainly in the United States, but I think in Europe and the rest of the world. And so this part of the talk is what would Milton Friedman say today? Because I think that he would look at this and say, yes, no, there are these negative externalities, and business has to address these problems. It has to think about the environment, and it has to think about what it can do to reduce poverty and inequality. So this is work I'm about to show you that just started in February of this year. So this is very recent work. This is actually the first time I'm talking about it in public. And so the prevailing standard for measuring greenhouse gases, which is the existential environmental and societal problem right now, was done by a UN group about 25 years ago. And they published a protocol that's still the fundamental measurement tool that's being used today. And what they identified is what they call Scope 1 emissions. And these are the emissions that a company does from its own assets. It's blast furnaces, it's steel mills, it's production facilities, it's mining operations, even drying its vehicles. So everyone recognized, yes, companies should be doing something about their own emissions. But they also recognize if you put too much pressure on companies to reduce the Scope 1 emissions, what they will do is outsource all the high polluting processes somewhere else, to some other company and maybe some other country. And it just shifts the pollution from their company to another one that's perhaps more inefficient and more polluting than they were. So that's not a very desirable outcome. So this group says companies also have to be involved for their Scope 3 emissions, which are all the emissions caused by companies in their supply chain and even downstream in their customer base. You have to look at your own emissions, but also the emissions that you cause by your purchases, as well as by the customers who buy and use your product. Now, even though this was a UN commission and they didn't have too many PhDs in math here, you wonder, why is it Scope 1 and Scope 3? They probably knew there's another integer between 1 and 3. Because this is strange to scientists, because these Scope 1 and Scope 3 are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And so there's not much room for some number in between, but they carved out some the electricity that a company consumes, which is a special case of a Scope 3 emission. How much emissions from your electricity supplier did you have? So you already knew that something was kind of strange with this taxonomy. But the biggest problem was this idea of how you are accountable for all of the companies in your supply chain. So let's start with a car door manufacturer, and the original raw material is some coal and iron ore mined by a company in Western Australia. That uses up a lot of energy and burns fossil fuel. They put it on a big ship to take it to the processor. That's also burning fossil fuel. Then it goes through furnaces and rolling mills at the steel company, gets back on the ship to go to the manufacturer. So now the car door manufacturer is taking the steel, making it into a door, as well along with some glass and fiber, and then they ship it to the factory. And so this automobile factory at this stage has 10 to 15,000 suppliers, one of which is the car door manufacturer. And if you were to follow this report, which is the current standard, you'd have to call up every one of your 15,000 suppliers and ask them, how much pollution did you send me in order to qualify for this particular standard? And you have to do this for every single product you make, which is bizarre. I mean, it's just infeasible. And eventually it gets to the person driving the car. But the other problem with this is not only infeasible, it doesn't make any sense, because every company in the supply chain is measuring the same emissions upstream and downstream. So in this case, the emissions are being counted 7 times over because there's 7 companies in this chain. This kind of violates a basic measurement principle. And this has gone on for 25 years until we just discovered this 4 months ago, that this didn't make any sense. So this is one of those measurement gaps. And it turns out you can solve this problem. And I said there's greenhouse gases all through the supply chain. So it turned out we could leverage my past work, activity-based costing for a multi-product company, how accountants build up cost from raw materials and production labor and overhead into finished goods. And then it turns out every time you sell the product to your customer, basically in the price, you cover all your costs. So you're transferring your cost up the value chain very naturally. And we realized this is exactly how to solve. This is the solution to the problem. Is just use the same approach we do for accumulating cost in a factory and then passing it upstream to our customers through the selling price. We could do this with greenhouse gases. So the proposal we have and this will appear in a Harvard Business Review article in about a month, just in time for the Glasgow conference on climate change that we hope they'll pay attention, is each one should measure its Scope 1 emissions. And we'll count that as a liability. It's a liability to society. It's use some clean air in order to do this. But then use activity-based costing, that my approach, drive down how much of the total emissions in that period is associated with each of the products that the company makes. And then when a customer buys it, we not only get revenue from them in cash, but we pass on to them the e-liability we've incurred. So these environmental liabilities just build up from stage to stage until finally the consumer will see it in the sticker. They'll see the selling price for the car and how much greenhouse gases were produced in order to have that car delivered to that customer. It's kind of a more important version of nutrition labels that consumers will see not only the price, but the content of ingredients and the calories and fat that are in the food product. The build-up from stage to stage, we can take advantage of the new information technology of blockchain to validate this at each stage. So the kind of the liability idea of a balance sheet comes in is a company has an opening liability that is yet to pass on to its customers from its blast furnaces or its vehicles, its production facilities. It picks up 2,600 tons of CO2. You could do this for each one of the greenhouse gases. And then all the things you purchase, you get the e-liabilities from your supplier, but then you get to subtract the e-liabilities in the products and services you sell to your customers, leaving you with some net balance at the end of the period. So accountants here will recognize what I'm about to show you is kind of a system of T accounts of a balance sheet for a company for its environmental liability. So the mining company on the right-hand side is building up from all its mining operations. Number two is the liability transferred downstream to the customers in the period. That's the shipping company. So that's part of its right-hand side of the liability purchased during the period. But then at some point it delivers it to the steel mills and other mills. And so it transfers some of that by the product to the steel mill. Then it gets to the door manufacturer, then to the car company, and eventually shows up in the sticker that the consumer has. And this will work. This absolutely will work because we've been doing it for costs for 200 years. And now it's the same approach, if you thought about it the right way, is going to work for the transfer of e-liability. So we think it's going to actually, this may have more impact than anything I've done in any of the that you've described in terms of giving us a workable way to get companies to recognize the effects of not just their production decisions, but their purchasing decisions and their distribution and selling decisions, and really be able to trace this across these value chains. Okay, so final story. So we've dealt with healthcare, we've done with the environment. Is how do we deal with these really desperately poor people? And the issue, 80% of them are actually smallholder farmers, which is why it's been so difficult because they're isolated. We just haven't connected them to corporate value chains and the kind of growth and income that corporations can do in their supply chain. They're not very knowledgeable about how to grow things. They don't have the right incentives. They don't have the right customers. They don't have the right technology. How do we solve this problem? Well, if you think about all the suppliers to this smallholder farmer, there's a lot of people that get involved. They need credit, they need insurance, they need seeds, they need irrigation, fertilizer, crop protection, tractors, storage, processing. They need funding that comes in from external funding. So to really make a difference, and this is the idea of having an ecosystem, we have to connect all these suppliers from the private, public, and NGO sectors, but have them all aligned to draw this smallholder farmers, up to 800 million of them, into corporate supply chains. But if we can do this, it's going to be transformational. And there are examples of this. So this is not hypothetical. And by forming some of these ecosystems, in 1 year you can double the income, and in 3 years you triple the income of these farmers, which is a huge deal. And we need their food if we're going to feed the number of people we're going to have in 2050. So by increasing their productivity, we increase their income, we reduce their environmental damage because they stop cutting down trees and the deforestation, which releases an enormous amount of greenhouse gases, and they learn efficient production. Now, the problem on this, what makes this hard, is unlike the corporate work I've been doing with Balanced Scorecard, you have shareholders and the CEO, they're very focused, how do we make more money now and in the future? Here we have lots of different players, each of whom has different interests. So we have environmentalists who want to preserve forest land and keep carbon trapped in the ground. That's important to them. The farmer wants to have increases in income and better family life. The seed producers want to sell seed. The crop protection want to sell crop protection. The feedlots want to get better supply, higher quality and more quantity. Retailers want products, higher quality and more. So this is a challenge. How do we get this alignment? And so what we've done is expand the Balanced Scorecard away from the unitary focus on shareholders, let's call it the Milton Friedman one, to this broader set of stakeholders. And the idea is that companies will, and the ecosystem should deliver better financial outcomes to keep people engaged and corporations investing in it, which is important, and also purchasing the outputs. But do this while we're improving social outcomes. And this is measurable. This gets back to measurement. We can measure the changes in income at the village level. We can look at the family life, the children going to school, women being freed from tedious work. And so those are all measurable outcomes at the farmer and village level, and improve environmental outcomes, kind of the triple bottom line. So it turns out, I don't know how, there's another committee that formed this ESG idea. The triple bottom line already existed in 2000, and environment's important, societal's important. What we learned is governance is not an outcome. Governance is a process. It doesn't belong with E and S. So we're going to stay focused on S, social outcomes, and E, environmental outcomes. And then the next level, instead of customers in the traditional Balanced Scorecard, all the players in the ecosystem, what do they want out of it? How do we measure their objectives? What's going to keep them engaged? How do we measure that? And what are the new processes of working together? Companies have to create products maybe that these poor people now with a little bit more income might want to buy, which is a good thing. So how do we produce products and deliver them to people at the bottom of the income pyramid? How do we get them in part of our supply chain as suppliers of products, as in farmers or even of talent, if we can educate them, and do this while improving our environmental management. And so we've now extended the Balanced Scorecard and its system of measurements to encompass these much broader objectives that we're trying to get corporations to become engaged in to improve reduce poverty and improve the environment. And the point is, once you get the big scorecard up there, then we can create scorecards for each of the players in the ecosystem. This is what helps keep them involved. We know what they want, how they connect to other people. And so the funny guy at the left is the catalyst. You can think about that as me or our Palladium people or nonprofits. They're the ones who kind of bring people together. And just like in a chemical reaction, the catalyst makes the reaction happen, even though it's not, strictly speaking, part of the reaction. So you need some external source to go in and get the people to realize how you create new value where everybody wins. I think this is the most important thing. It gets back to the brilliance of capitalism, is you can do all these things and make every single player in this ecosystem better off. By being more productive. It's not a zero-sum game where you tax companies to get more income for poor people. No, everybody's going to win. So that's really what excites me about this approach. So in conclusion, I look at these three things. What did I remember from my studies at MIT, which we just had our 60th reunion? We didn't have, we had one computer with 32K of memory for the entire campus. So all the engineers and scientists, we got through MIT on something called the slide rule. And the slide rule, you got the first digit right, you kind of got a pretty good idea of the second, and then you figured out where the decimal point went. And by doing this, you always connected to reality. You never came up with really stupid results, or that's when you get a bad grade on the exam. So the numbers you came up with all had to make sense. They had to anchor in some physical or chemical reality. And that's what I've tried to do over these 60 years. Accounting's really important, but the numbers have to make sense. They have to really correspond to what's happening on the ground. Unfortunately, some of the accounting are measured to 6 significant digits. If you pick up any income statement, you'll see 6 digits, and often the first digit is wrong. So I learned that at MIT, that if the first digit's wrong, don't worry about the next 5. So my goal, people have called me the engineering of accountants, is to come up with accounting approaches which get the first digit right, pretty close on the second, and I know where the decimal points should go. And with those simple guidance, you can see how accounting can play a huge role in these areas like healthcare and the environment and society, income, poverty, and inequality. Thank you very much.
Vážený pane profesore Kaplane, doktore ekonomie honoris causa Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze, mnohokrát děkuji za váš inspirativní projev. Nyní prosím o vystoupení smyčcové kvarteto Kaprálová kvartet. V jeho podání vyslechneme 4 věty smyčcového kvartetu F-dur opus 96 Antonína Dvořáka s názvem Americký. Antonín Dvořák složil tuto skladbu během svého letního pobytu v jedné americké maličké vesničce ve státě Iowa. Říká se mu americký nejen proto, že vznikl na americké pevnině, ale i díky mnoha prvkům typickým pro původní, zejména indiánskou hudbu. Premiéra se uskutečnila na Nový rok 1894 v Bostonu. Dílo mělo velký úspěch a patří do repertoáru slavných kvartet po celém světě dodnes. Vaše magnificence, magnificí, spektabiles, honorabiles, vážení hosté, děkuji vám všem za účast na dnešním slavnostním zasedání Vědecké rady Vysoké školy ekonomické v Praze. Zasedání ukončíme studentskou hymnou Gaudeamus Igitur.
Gaudeamus